Thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Eide, for speaking with me today. So first of all, could you just introduce yourself briefly?
My name is Stephen Eide. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. I'm also a contributing editor to City Journal. The Manhattan Institute is a New York City-based public policy think tank. My research focuses mainly on homelessness and mental health.
Thank you. Could you give the top 3 reasons for why California is facing crisis of homelessness right now?
Well, homelessness is a complicated problem. There are many reasons why someone could fall into homelessness, lose access to stable housing. And it's a term that we slap onto a collection of problems. And sometimes it makes it difficult for us to figure out what we should do about it. But I would say that housing is an important part of it. If you are someone who lives in a community where the number of very low rent apartments is scarce, you're going to be at greater risk of homelessness. There is also the behavioral health drivers of homelessness, drug addiction, and untreated serious mental illness. If you have one of those afflictions, you're at a much greater risk of homelessness. And related to the sort of public disorder / criminal justice element of the problem, many communities in California have adopted these sort of what I would call informal accommodation approaches towards street homelessness. They, when people are living on the street and violating some sort of ordinance or law, code, there is greater reluctance than there used to be to act on those violations to try to encourage people to not live on the street. So those are, I think, the 3 reasons why it seems to be worse, though it's been a problem in California since the 1980s. We think of modern homelessness as a problem that arose in the early 1980s. There is a sense in which in California in particular, it seems to be worse now than it was 10, 15 years ago.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I looked at the data just in the past 5 years. Homelessness has increased by close to 40% in California, while the rest of the country, most of the rest of the country, except for New York City, has seen a drop in homelessness. So I want to follow up on your last point about this reluctance of enforcing certain rules. So why is that happening in California, but not elsewhere?
Well, there may be a sense, I think you're an economist, right?
Yes.
Yeah, right. So I think to some extent what you have with street homelessness is kind of an agglomeration issue, dynamics, where it's harder to be the first street homeless person in a community than it is the 2001st person. In many most American communities, the street homeless population is very small, or it just doesn't exist at all. In California, you have encampments that have grown to hundreds of people. And when you have a situation like that, where these encampments have sort of brand names, they're heavily covered in the news, they're just known in the whole region, they're going to attract certain people. There's maybe people on the margins, there may be people who already are living life in which lots of other things are going wrong, but you're more likely to sort of attract more street homelessness when you already have a certain kind of critical mass of it. And that's a situation that California in particular has had, I think, over the last 10, 15 years, which is contributing to why we've seen, again, an already considerable problem get bigger.
I see. Thank you for that. So since you talk about, the existing homelessness population may attract more to join them. So do you think based on data or other observations, do you think mobility or relocation play a role in California's homelessness challenge?
Well, California, I think more than any other American jurisdiction, homelessness really is a regional problem, and where you really have communities complaining, bickering at one another, at sending their homeless people to each other, or regulating the way, using law enforcement to shoo them across borders. I mean, these debates come up all the time. I think in homeless services circles where progressives are dominant, people really resist the idea that anyone chooses to be homeless. But at some level, people do choose where to be homeless. And in California, you do have these situations where, the Bay Area is a big place. I think there is a degree to which people do think that maybe San Francisco is a better place to live on the streets than somewhere else. So that's that's why and that regional aspect of the problem, which is not, it doesn't have, homelessness doesn't have that regional as a dimension everywhere in America, but in California it's very pronounced. And that also explains, I think, why the state government is so, there's a sense at which the state government really needs to get involved in California, which is not the case elsewhere in America. State governments don't have a major role in setting homeless policy, but in California it certainly does.
Is that always the case, that state government in California is heavily involved in managing homelessness? Or is that always the case, or just more recent?
Well, my sense is that it's increased. Certainly the amount of money that the state is spending has increased. And because the state has access to like income tax revenues, there's just an expectation that that would be used on the most important questions, according to public polls, and that's certainly homelessness at the moment in California. State certainly has always had a big role in related problems, mental health in particular, in America, going back as far as we've ever had a mental health policy. State governments have had a major role in mental health. That's certainly the case in California. So maybe there's some expectation that comes with that. But yeah, I do think that the state has taken a more active role in California than was the case like 15, 20 years ago.
Thank you for sharing that. So since you're talking about mental health illness, maybe I'll jump to my last few questions, which focuses on mental health. So we know that in 2004, California passed the Mental Health Services Act, which levies 1% income tax on millionaires, basically. It was originally designed to transform California's behavioral health system to better serve people with serious mental health issues. So it's been almost 20 years, right? 2004, now it's 2022. So almost 20 years since the passing of the act. However, at the same time, if you look at the data, we see California has a declining number of psychiatric facilities, declining number of psychiatric beds. So why does the tax revenue not making a dent?
Yeah, I've studied the system in New York City as well, and in both in the case of New York and California, you have public mental health systems, which on paper look like they should be the best in America. I mean, Californians and New Yorkers, like, they really don't have the sense that if you go to places like in the South or in the Midwest, I mean, you have hundreds of counties in America where there's not even one psychiatrist, where there is no mental health system in these places. And yet, why is it that you have these systems that seem to have so much capacity, that check so many boxes in terms of what you would want from an effective mental health system, particularly resources, dedicated resources, as you say, just seem to be such an embarrassment and seem to be such a disgrace. I think that in the case of the Mental Health Service Act revenues in particular, there has always been this debate over what kind of mental health challenges, what kind of mental disorders those revenues really need to be going towards. Mental health is also a big issue in America. You know, in the COVID context, we're having a lot of debate right now about the mental health side effects of the lockdowns for kids in schools. Those are not the type of mental health challenges that you're talking about when you're talking about like street homelessness and untreated schizophrenia. And, you know, as serious as I think the lockdown debate is, you know, I think there is some sense in which that represents this struggle, this tug for these resources, and also just the sort of priorities that we want our mental health policymakers to focus on. And there's always been some sense in which people are wanting to focus on what would have to be described as easier problems. Or there's just something really uncomfortable about people with untreated schizophrenia and violent tendencies. There's something just really frustrating and depressing about, you know, when you're asked what to do about somebody who's been living on the street for years, is addicted to methamphetamine, and even before all that started, developed schizophrenia, has no social supports, and will refuse, and related to that, just is really service resistant, will turn down all manner of help that mental health service providers, well-meaning people, are trying to give to them. What do? We used to be more uncomfortable with involuntary commitment, to be more comfortable with the idea that if someone's not in possession of their faculties, maybe it doesn't make sense that they're to think of them as a perfectly free and rational actor. We're more reluctant to go down that route now. And as a result, we have a mental health system which provides a lot of help for people who are willing to pursue it. For parents of troubled teenagers spend all their time thinking about what kind of services can I get for my child. But in the case of people who are either indifferent to services or actively resist participating in services, we're kind of at a loss. And until we figure out what to do about that latter part of the problem, we're still going to have big problems with street homelessness.
So in that case, what can we do? What can the government do or local activists do to promote more awareness of this latter part where people who have severe mental illnesses, they may be resistant to any help that they actually need?
I think we need to target our resources far more to the seriously mentally ill. We also need to just do more to reconcile ourselves to hard truths about how much we can expect people to recover from serious mental illnesses. There's a lot of focus on sort of stigma and how mental health is something that afflicts everybody, and so you shouldn't feel bad about it. And I think that kind of foregrounds the parts of the problem that I was talking about earlier that are easier to work on than the more difficult, and it gives us an excuse to not work on the more difficult problems. And ultimately where this heads is reconcile ourselves more to involuntary forms of treatment. We need to invest far more in inpatient psychiatric hospital beds than we do. And involuntary, in the case of people who we don't think necessarily need involuntary treatment, we need to make more use of community-based forms of involuntary treatment, such as Laura's Law or conservatorships. But so far, as far as I can tell from observing the debate, the changes that we're considering in terms of our mental health use of mental health resources and our laws regarding involuntary commitment are really modest changes that we're considering right now. Mm. So we have a long way to go in terms of what we think we're comfortable with.
So I want to ask you, just now you mentioned there are some popular thinking that mental illnesses affect the society at a very high prevalence rate. So is that really true? Do you have data that compare the prevalence rate of severe mental illnesses among the general population versus among the homeless, especially the street homeless population? Do you have like a rough sense about the comparison?
What we consider to be serious mental illness or severe mental illness, which is an official government term that's used in all types of programs and bureaucratic stuff, we generally think of that as 4 to 5% of the adult population. When you're talking about the homeless population, that would be between 25 and 33%, I would say. If you're talking about the homeless population, including people who are in shelter, and also who are still parts of families. If you're talking about the street population, you would probably talking about certainly the upper end of that 25 to 33% estimate, and perhaps more, 40 to 50%. So that's anyone, for various reasons, we're not entirely sure about how many people among the homeless population have a serious mental illness, and we probably never will be. But there's no question that, similar to the jail population, no one disputes that it's disproportionate.
Thank you for that. So I would also want to ask you about the community-based services. So you mentioned Laura's Law, but it was not actively, well, maybe not very popular, maybe not, should be used more than it is right now. So can you talk a little bit about that in California?
Well, assisted outpatient treatment is a program that New York makes a lot of use of. And in fact, New York is now debating making more use of it because of these very bad problems relating to subway violence that have made a lot of news headlines recently. The name of the assisted outpatient treatment, both in New York and California, it's a state law that's implemented locally. And in California, that's at the county level, I believe. And the name, in New York, it's called Kendra's Law, and in California, it's called Laura's Law. And this is a program that's for people who have a serious mental illness, have had kind of a rocky time staying in treatment and achieving mental stability. And so you are put in a mandated treatment program. You set up, using the court system, you set up a treatment program that you expect people to comply with. And so it provides a degree of kind of structure to someone's life. They're not in a hospital, they're not in a jail, they're living in a community, but they have more structure in their life than they did before, where things didn't seem to be going very well. It raises civil liberties concerns, and it also raises concerns about use of resources, because you have to commit the resources to put together these programs to commit somebody to. But I think that if we were going to be reluctant to using hospitals, and although we need to probably be needing to do more of that, certainly we need to be focusing more on assisted outpatient treatment, which is a good way to keep people out of hospitals, by the way.
So how does that really work? Say you have, do you have like clinicians coming to your home or coming to the community, or do you have people supervising a person with mental illness?
Well, they have programs that they're expected to attend, or there could be clinicians that are doing regular check-ins on them. It's just it's a degree of both treatment. That's the core idea. We're really trying to treat the mental illness, so medication is going to be involved, some sort of therapy is probably going to be involved, but there's also just this kind of like degree of supervision that the program provides to prevent people from falling through the cracks, because a lot of times that's what happens. You have somebody who's they go to a day program for a while, or they're sort of engaged in something for a while, but then they are dropping away. No one knows exactly how they're spending their time. They clearly seem to be doing not as well, and then the next thing you know, they've You see them on the streets, or they push somebody in front of a subway train, they fall through the cracks, and that's what always happens. So it's like, who's responsible? I don't know. Is it the local Department of Homeless Services? Is it the County Department of Mental Health? I don't know. So there's just this degree of kind of accountability along with the structure and supervision that comes with assisted outpatient treatment.
So would you consider assisted outpatient treatment a conservatorship or a kind of conservatorship?
It's similar to conservatorship. A conservatorship is more like, and I'm not the world's leading expert on California mental health law, but conservatorship, well, so you remember with the Britney Spears case, right? So it was all about her dad. Like, so there was this other person in her life had all these powers over her that she didn't want. Assisted outpatient treatment is not like that one person, it's this program, this structure that we put in place that has people, that has a judge and like people who are involved, but it's not this one person who has kind of like all these powers over someone's life that that person normally would have. But that's something that we also is very much part of the mix, part of the debate in California. And that also is something that could be very valuable to do, because very valuable to explore, when people reach adulthood, parents don't have the type of authority over them that they used to have. A big issue that comes up is access to health information. Parents can't legally access like information on how well their child is doing in some sort of mental health programming. So that just creates all types of problems. So we need to think about ways to, within the larger civil liberties context, make, exceptions or modifications for people who, we really think if we're just going to provide them with absolute respect for their freedom, that they're going to deteriorate, harm themselves, harm their family, and so on.
Thank you for sharing that information. It's really helpful. Seems to me that the outpatient treatment is very useful for people whose maybe their mental illness is not so severe, so deteriorated yet. Seems like, because if they're really, I don't know, like if their mental health is really compromised, then they can just drop out and you will lose track of them, would you?
Well, I think there's a lot to that, what you just said. Mental health, to begin, is a spectrum. There are people who have anxiety disorders, but who have normal jobs, and maybe, in fact, they do better at their job because they're always anxious about succeeding. Or, they're a novelist and they wouldn't be as deep of a person if they weren't depressed every so often. But then you have the serious mental illnesses, which are really more of like disabilities, which qualify you for disability and which are just incapacitating, which destroy families, destroy lives. Even within that category, you have a certain spectrum. You have people who they understand that they have a mental illness, and they understand that taking medication is what they need to do if they want other nice things, like a comfortable house, like normal relationships and stuff like that. So that requires a kind of, recognition, intellectual clarity. Then you have other people who are so sick that they reject the idea that they're sick. They don't have insight. They have this, anosognosia problem. And so that's a big reason why they don't accept the need. They don't take medication, because that's what crazy people do, and I'm not crazy. And they don't participate in programs. Those are people who we're really, really worried about. There are also people who are violent, who, in the case of New York, we've had a couple incidents recently where, in the case of these two cops who were fatally shot, and also somebody who pushed a woman in front of a subway train. In both those cases, the perpetrator said, "I'm God. I know I'm God." They said that they were God. So those are cases in which, like, the mental illness really seems to be causing the violence. There's this tight connection. So those are people who, you really would. The standard criteria for committing someone to a hospital is that they're dangerous to self or others. So retrospectively, it was obvious that these people were dangerous. So those would be people who, yeah, you would want a degree of kind of like confinement or essentially incapacitation so they can't do anything bad. But assisted outpatient treatment would be in the middle there because it's a restraint on civil liberties. It can't just be casually used, is the understanding. There needs to be a kind of understanding that this is to a degree a special case. There are signs that this person could deteriorate and maybe become violent if we don't do something now. But this is kind of the problem that we live with in mental health care in America, that because it's a spectrum, because these illnesses come in such a great variety, to do it right, yeah, there is some sense in which we need various different approaches, but how do you link the right person with the appropriate approach? What do you deal with this fragmentation of programs? To some extent, we're just going to be fated with that, and we need to make the most of it.
Right. I really like you used the word retrospectively, that person was dangerous. But most of the time we don't know. If we just look at a homeless person in New York subway, looks just fine to me. So the cops couldn't even know, right? And even if the person, maybe a particular homeless person is behaving, sort of violently, but not considered an imminent danger to others yet. So where is that threshold lying, right? How can police accurately measure that threshold so that they can protect the safety of the public and also respect the autonomy of homeless population?
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, the violent cases are the easiest to deal with. Like when someone commits an act of violence, and even now, when there's all the debate about progressive prosecution and all these new policies, the criminal justice reform agenda. If someone attacks someone or kills someone, yeah, we know what to deal with that. But when it doesn't come to that, what are we talking about? I remember reading in a book about mental illness, this incident where this mentally ill man was standing on a crowded subway platform in New York City, and he was going around sniffing all these women's hair. These are complete strangers. This is rush hour. These women are going to work, trying to get on the subway, go to work. And this strange man was going around sniffing all of their hair. And one of the women was an undercover police officer. And so she arrested him and charged him with some sort of, misdemeanor crime or violation. And it turned out that this guy, part of his mental illness was that he believed that he was allergic to some forms of shampoo. And so he really didn't want to board a subway train that was going to require him to stand next to a woman with a shampoo he was allergic to, because that would be bad. So the point is that this guy is essentially harmless. But if you think that women have a right to not have their hair smelled by strange men, probably we need a law against that. And probably the law needs to be enforced by police officers. Mm-hmm. So police officers, I think, have a lot more experience dealing with these situations than than a lot of people realize, because in places like Midtown Manhattan, it's even if they have no special training, they just deal with it all the time. And so they can develop a sense in which some guys are, perfectly harmless, but just disturbing. But whatever we're going to do about those like lower level types of forms of disorder, it's going to have to be law enforcement that has the lead there. But a lot of people seem to not want to be reconciled to that idea at the moment.
There's also the lack of long-term psychiatric treatment. So even if a policeman arrests somebody, would take the person to a ER, psychiatric ER, the person would be released within 24 hours or 48 hours. And so that would disincentivize the cop from doing the same thing again next time. And then that could threaten the public safety if the homeless person turned out to be violent.
Yeah, there's you can hold someone temporarily 72 hours or so, But by that time, very often they're stabilized to a degree, so they're not imminently dangerous.
Mhm.
And so they have to be let go. And so the cycle repeats itself. Yeah, involuntary long-term commitment or just intermediate length commitment is something that we used to have more toleration for, but we just don't like this idea now. And so as a result, people are just circling
Mhm.
through these systems.
Yeah. So I would like to perhaps switch gear to housing. So since you also mentioned housing is one contributing factor to homelessness, so we also talked about mental health and housing. There is the popular movement of so-called housing first movement. And then you provide permanent supportive housing to a homeless person with chronic illnesses or chronic disability. The treatment is only voluntary but not mandatory. So basically, you're providing a roof without accompanying that roof with any treatment. So how is that going to work in the long term?
Yes. Very big topic. Housing first. It's the dominant question in some ways in homelessness policy. And I know you're talking to a lot of housing firsters as part of this project, because most people in homeless services are housing first proponents. I think housing first. Okay, so you asked how's it going to work? I'm not a housing first proponent. Um, um, well, I think that it's mainly there's a question as to what you're trying to achieve with housing first. Are you just trying to get people off the streets? You know, in California, there have been, a number of recent successful ballot initiatives in which the public agreed to support increased taxes for more homeless services and permanent housing in particular. To a degree, I think some of the expectation there was that there are too many people on the streets. This is bad for public order. I just want them off the street. But the promise of housing first is always more robust than that. That no, we're not just like getting people off the streets and out of everyone's view. We're really trying to improve their lives. But exactly how much we're improving their lives is a real question, because housing first is a policy that has been extensively studied, and it doesn't seem to be the case that it achieves very much in terms of the life improvements that most people would be thinking of, meaning substance abuse, mental illness, and social isolation. It seems to keep people housed, at least for the length of the study, which typically runs 1 to 2 years, sometimes as much as 5 years. But it doesn't seem to achieve a lot more than that. The argument for housing first is that it's better at keeping people housed than any other approach would be. But there are other, if we look out beyond homelessness policy into other systems, mental health, addiction services, there are other approaches that are not necessarily housing related that are trying to focus on those larger goals of mental stability, sobriety, and those somehow don't factor into the debate in homelessness, where it's really just about what type of housing program are we talking about, and isn't the only thing we're trying to do with housing programs residential stability. So that's the housing first proponents, I think, have kind of like set up the standards for success, and then also put forth the program by which we're going to meet those standards. So if we're going to be talking about something more than just like short-term residential stability, because there seem to be some questions as to what housing first programs achieve over the long term, but just focusing on short-term residential stability, I understand the argument there. But if we're going to be talking about achieving larger goals, then then we need to be talking about something beyond just housing first. And by the way, everything that I just said there doesn't relate at all to the more general frustration in California, which is that we seem to be spending a ton of money on permanent supportive housing programs. It takes forever to bring these units online. They're so expensive, and we just never seem to see any difference. So doesn't that also lead towards the question of trying something else?
Yeah, I totally agree. I read the Housing First papers by Sam Sembrus in early 2000. And I think those papers are great, and then they're well cited. But then the limitation is those results were generated in the laboratory setting, where you have permanent supportive housing and you have a team of dedicated experts on mental illness, on drug addiction. So, you have the perfect condition, which generate some kind of success, which you already said, housing stability. But even in that perfect situation, they don't really find encouraging results related to reducing drug use or improving their mental health. And also no results related to labor force participation. So I feel like, that's like in the perfect laboratory results, and we cannot really scale that up to a society where you may have a permanent supportive housing unit, but you may not have supportive team of clinicians. You may not have team of, I don't know, like drug treatment experts. So like we know that's not going to work in California, especially as you just said, it's so expensive in California to build. It takes forever to bring those housing units online. So all this logic makes sense, right? But why are we so wedded to housing first so far? In California, everybody that I talked with so far, including policymakers, nonprofits who build housing, they're just so in belief of housing first. It's like impossible to persuade them otherwise. So why is that the case? If we don't change this mentality, we will continue to waste money. I shouldn't say waste money. We'll continue to divert financial resources from perhaps other options like, building a good shelter or provide good mental health treatment. We'll continue to divert financial resources from those options to only build very expensive permanent supportive housing.
Yes, and also I would say in terms of the research, I know you're seem to be from the academic world. I mean, it's important also not to get too hung up on just what the housing first research itself says, but also what research about just subsidized housing in general says, because there's a lot of research about the Section 8 program and the just experience with subsidized housing programs in America going back to, the 1930s. And, housing programs outside the homeless context work with populations that are actually on average less trouble than the homeless population, and also just have kind of underwhelming results in terms of upward mobility, larger goals. And so it's like you're essentially trying to achieve the same thing with a more troubled population that hasn't been, overperforming with just a sort of low income population more generally. I think the housing first, well, for one thing, there is, this may sound conspiratorial, but there is a kind of follow the money type of aspect to the housing first question. The federal government, through which is a significant source of funding for homeless programs, essentially requires housing first. There are people in the home who got into the homeless services business over the last, let's say, 20 years. You find far more of them in line with housing first, because in order to finance programs, you kind of have to be online with it. Most of the people I know who are the staunchest opponent, or many of the people I know who are staunch opponents to housing first, got into the homeless services business like back in like the 1980s before it was big. And I think there's just this argument that, well, you can't do anything else until you get someone housed. So there's nothing more important that we can do is just to keep building out our housing capacity, and then we'll get to all that stuff later, okay? But we got to get the housing in place. And in a weird way, when housing is like harder to build, when it's more expensive, that like increases the intensity that like we need to focus even more on building that housing. But it's just really vague about what what does supportive mean? Well, it's some promise of services, but I've read all those studies too, and like exactly what these services are, what they achieve, is that the same services that are being applied in all these programs, or just because it was this one program in New York, is that what it looks like everywhere? In the journalistic coverage and academic studies, it's really unclear. And having visited permanent supportive housing programs, one thing I've learned is that, if you're a conscientious provider, you understand that you have a very troubled population on your hands. And so you want to really make the most out of the money that comes for the services component. And maybe you want to go out and get more money for services because that's what you need to provide from. But is that what every provider is going to do? Or they're just going to be like, well, if he wants to sit in a room all day by himself, that's his choice. I'll try, I'm available. If he wants to come speak to me voluntarily, that's fine. But otherwise, I'm just going to let him be there. Permanent supportive housing has very high mortality rates. Looking out further down the years, there's a very good study out of Boston you probably saw, was published this past April, which looked at people who had been put in a permanent supportive housing program, I think 14, 15 years out, and relatively few of those people were still in that same program, either because they left or because of mortality or something like that. A lot of people, when they're put in permanent supportive housing, are kind of old, like in their 40s and 50s, and so there's a sense in which, well, we're just not really expecting that much from them anyway. We just want to kind of give them a nice place to live in their remaining years. I mean, like that's essentially the way it works. That's not how it's advertised, but in practice, that's how it plays out on the ground. So it's kind of just a depressing reality, and it just doesn't, I think it doesn't deserve the reputation that it has.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like the program may work better in a place in the Midwest, where housing is so cheap. That's fine, right? You can provide all the housing you want. But in California, and especially the coastal Bay Area, it's just so expensive and slow to build. So, and we're sort of like wasting time and the resources to focus on one thing, and that's overpromising us. I want to ask you about the service providers you just mentioned. So I talked with some of them too, managers for permanent supportive housing, and they're really compassionate people. They care, but at the same time, they seem to be really overtasked with things that they're not trained to do. They're not clinicians, but they have to manage a large group of people who may have mental illnesses or drug addiction on site. And then they also need to make sure they de-escalate conflicts between the troubled tenants and the other tenants who are there purely for economic reasons. And so I feel like, what is the goal for permanent supportive housing, and how do we assess the quality of the services they provide? Do people ever ask that? How do we compare the quality of permanent supportive housing?
Yeah, are we going to evaluate? How do we evaluate these providers? Are we going to like realistically say you need to get this many people lives improved in this way, and otherwise we're going to yank your contract? I don't think we really say that. So what are the expectations? Well, I think it's weird. Homelessness is a weird concept. It's a weirder concept that people realize, because you're talking about a population that's so diverse. This is not a term that we used before the 1980s. It was invented by advocates in order to sort of divert from all the complications and focus just on the sort of housing oriented goal. If we are going to have government agencies that are homeless agencies, programs that are homelessness programs, we're always going to have these ambiguities that you're talking about. So, another way to do it was just be to, not have these agencies and programs. We can still help people through mental health, through addiction, through workforce development. And we can even, by the way, provide housing programs through those agencies instead of doing it through homelessness. I think even supportive housing is a strange concept. Okay, so you think about, what is special education? Well, that's supportive education. So Instead of taking kids who have developmental disability problems and putting them in their own schools, which is what we used to do, we're going to put them in a normal mainstream setting, but we're going to support them. So theoretically, at least, they're pursuing the same educational goals as everybody else, but we give them these supports to make sure that they help them meet the goals because we understand that they're different. So there's something called supportive employment for people with mental disabilities, where it's like, in order to live a meaningful life, somebody with a mental disability, we want to give them part-time employment, but in order to work with employers, and because that's not always going to work out, we need to have these supports in place. Housing, as distinct from education and employment, those are activities. Those have goals embedded in them. Housing is not really an activity. I mean, it's just like, so what does it even mean to support? I mean, there's ambiguity of whether you're trying to support them, meaning, okay, if this guy keeps lighting fires in his room, we need to like intervene to make sure that no one gets hurt or that he can somehow keep there. Or are you trying to provide the support so that they achieve something above just like staying in the apartment and not getting evicted because they're like attacking their neighbors or something like that? I mean, I don't think that's ever been sorted out. And maybe that's just because it's just a weirder idea to say you're supporting housing as opposed to education or employment.
I totally agree. Yeah, I feel right now permanent supportive housing, those staff members, they're playing many roles. They're nurses, they're police, they're managers. They're also trying to help people to fill out paperwork for disability checks. So I think they're overtasked. And I totally agree. Housing is not an activity. Why do we have this concept of permanent supportive housing in the first place? Yeah, so I also want to ask you talk a little bit about this concept of the so-called industrial complex of organizations, right? So when we talk about that from a distance, I'm like, they're so inefficient. They're wasting money, and then they're causing all the problem. Let's just get rid of them. But then when I talk with each one of them who are a part of it, then I'm like, wow, that person spent her life. She devoted her life to helping people with homeless problems, and then I just feel like you're talking about somebody's career, and then they have vested interest, and then some of them are very compassionate. So it's not an easy thing to solve in the short term, at least. What do you think?
I think there's something to the idea that people can be very unfair when they're accusing providers of selfishness, feather bedding. I think there's some sense in sometimes the criticisms can be very extreme where it's like, oh, they're just trying to keep this thing going so that they can keep their job. Well, the normal service provider wouldn't have a clue how to eliminate homelessness if you like put a gun to their head and demanded that they do it. I mean, it's just like there is this big problem. No one knows how to get rid of it completely. We pay them to do something about it. In America, there's this preference for giving nonprofit contractors money that we could theoretically just have government do on its own. There would be the same kind of sense of interest either way. But for some reason, we just like this idea that it's less bureaucratic, it's somehow closer to the ground, it's community-based, to give these nonprofit organizations the contracts and let them manage these problems. It does create certain problems with transparency. It also creates certain problems with accountability, even though it should be, it's very complicated trying to take contracts away. Theoretically, it's like, okay, you're this innovative, so theoretically, this should all be like charter schools. Okay, so it's like, you've got a great model, you're gonna show us how great your model is by proving these, doing well in these tests, these scores. And if you don't do well, we're gonna take that away and give it to somebody else. So it kind of should work like that, but it works very different from that in reality. It's hard to take contracts away. So there is a sense in which it tends to become very bureaucratic. And there is a sense in which personal interest plays a role. Reform is very difficult when people's livelihoods are at stake. If someone's paycheck and livelihood is essentially dependent on housing first, it's kind of hard to have a sort of open debate about what we really know about it. So that's a reality in every form of social policy, in every field of government work where you give somebody money to provide a service. We
Yeah.
can, I guess we could just cut everybody checks. This could be like UBI. It's like we just lay everyone off, put all that into checks, send that out, and hope that sort of solves everything for us. But no, we want to pay money to human beings to perform these compassionate services and programs, to keep an eye out from people, to rehabilitation, education, therapy that requires human beings. And so, it does create problems of accountability ultimately, because if you want to change, you've kind of created a situation where people, for very understandable reasons, are going to be resistant to change.
So do you see if there's a reform in the future, does it have to come from the federal level? Because that's where the Housing First movement came from originally.
I think federal change would be very important, because I think that if, there certainly are communities in America outside the coast which have not completely bought into Housing First, but which kind of have to do it because the federal government is telling them to do. That would be very important. There may be the case in which there's some change happening in California, because the Housing First and permanent supportive housing, in a way, it's been so oversold that people realize you can't tell me that I'm not going to see any difference on the streets until every single person who's homeless has their own housing unit. Because I know what that means is that I'm just going to be waiting forever. You need to tell me what you're going to do about public disorder while we're waiting for all the housing to arrive. I think to some extent that is a question that politicians and policymakers in California feel the need to engage with to a degree, because these programs have just been so slow, and the results just have not been seen in terms of the ordinary person on the street. I mean, you can say, well, you have to understand, in order to build housing, you have to braid these funding sources together, and the units will be coming. It just takes a lot of time, and we have all these rules we have to comply by. You can't tell that to people, because that's never enough. Like, you need to be able to say, yeah, ultimately we're going to deal with both the problem on the streets and also improve people's lives. And that's just, I think you saw the passage of all these ballot initiatives. I don't think you would see that over the next 5 years like you saw it over the past 5 years.
HHH, that's just it's a disappointment when they find out how much it would cost to build one unit. It's like 400,000 to 500,000 to build one unit. So I would maybe end the interview by maybe see whether there are any bright spots or any optimistic ideas in the future. But we see Project Roomkey, Project Homekey, those were launched in California during the pandemic. They're pretty much just non-congregate shelters and permanent supportive housing at a lower cost. So do you think those are the right way to go? Or if not, do you have any other thoughts on, good ideas for the future?
I think the hotel conversion idea just attracts a lot of enthusiasm because of the frustration over HHH. I think it really just replicates a lot of the problems that have always been associated with building PSH, particularly funding services. So I'm just not as enthusiastic about it as I think it's been a bit of a distraction. I don't know. I think the law and order, the law enforcement, the public disorder component is going to be key. Like, you just can't think the social services system as we have it right now is going to be able to deal with the disorder problems. That's the social services system. There's just so little accountability. The performance is so poor. I mean, people wind up in the criminal justice system because they failed out of the social services system. So how are you going to give more responsibility to the social services? So you're going to have to move along both those tracks. And we're just going to have to reconcile ourselves to the idea that law enforcement have a role. That's something I'm particularly watching for, because or if there's going to be a change there, you might also see some changes on the fronts relating to involuntary commitment, things like that.
And do you know any states that are doing something on that direction?
What I say about homelessness and kind of best practices is that, like, just don't let it get out of control in the first place. Because I don't know of a community that is allowed to get everything as bad as it is in like San Francisco and then got it under control. So, like Austin, Texas, just don't let it become like San Francisco, because if it does, I don't know what the model is in terms of getting it back under control. So if there were any social policy problems that should be addressed through prevention, homelessness would be one of them.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your support, and please stay well and healthy.
Thanks for having me.